friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Lauren, you may also call me Lo, and today I'm bringing you my June wrap-up, or all of the books that I read in June. So thank you so much for being here. I hope you're doing well, and let's get on into it. Alright, so starting with some stats as usual. In June, I read a total of 9 books and 2,767 pages. Of those pages, 1,205 were from listening to audiobooks, and 1,552 pages were from physically reading. The average book length was 306 pages. So this is the first month this year that I've read less than 3,000 pages in a month. But I'm not incredibly upset about it. I still read 9 books, which is kind of on par with every other month this year. And I also had a great reading month in terms of my enjoyment of books, which you'll see in a second. Alright, so of the 9 books that I read, 4 were YA and 5 were adult. And the genres are truly all over the place. We've got 2 sci-fis, 2 fantasies, 2 nonfictions, 1 thriller, 1 horror, and 1 romance. When it comes to ratings, I rated 1 book 2 stars, 1 book 3 stars, 4 books 4 stars, and 2 books 5 stars, for an average of 3.87 stars. And that is the highest average rating I've ever had this year, so that's a really great sign. I'm very, very happy with that. I hardly ever give 2 5 stars in a month, and I usually end up giving most of the books I read 3 stars, so the fact that there was only 1 says a lot, I think. So I kicked off June with a nonfiction read, which I'm very happy about because I recently posted a nonfiction recommendations video in which I said I wanted to start reading more nonfiction books, and I read 2 this month, so very, very happy with that. And this book in particular was Cultish by Amanda Montell. This is a relatively recent release, I think, and I didn't really know much about it going into it. I knew it was about cults from like the title, but I hadn't read the summary and I kind of went into it blind. So it wasn't exactly what I was expecting, but I liked it nonetheless. So Amanda Montell is a linguist. So she's studied and researched the language that cults and cultish groups use to indoctrinate people and get people to do what they want them to do. So the book discusses real cults like Jonestown, but it also discusses cultish groups. She uses the term cultish a lot, hence the title of the book. And those cultish groups include Scientology, which debatably is a real cult, MLMs and SoulCycle, CrossFit, those kinds of like cult exercise groups. And overall, I thought this book was really, really interesting. There were a couple of lulls for me where I kind of lost interest, but I usually regained it relatively fast. And in general, I thought this was a very entertaining read. I think I learned a lot about what a cult is and like why people get involved in cults. And yeah, I definitely recommend this one if it sounds like something that you would like. I definitely recommend it to people who are into like pop culture. It feels almost like a documentary, and in that regard, it's really, really cool. And I ended up giving this one 4 stars. The next book I read in June was Skyward by Brandon Sanderson. This was the first book in my Colors Choose My TBR vlog that I posted in June. It should be the video directly before this one. This is a YA sci-fi that takes place on a planet that is constantly under attack by an alien force called the Krell. And in this society, in order to stay safe, they have fighter pilots who are constantly fighting off the Krell. And our main character, Spensa, dreams of one day becoming a fighter pilot, and she's worked her entire life to be able to become one. But she's facing significant barriers because her father was a fighter pilot, and during a very important battle, he abandoned his crew and was labeled as a coward, and he also was killed during that battle. So Spensa and her family have been labeled kind of the family of a coward. And a coward in this society is pretty much the worst thing you could possibly be. So her family is kind of ostracized, she's kind of ostracized, and the flight school does not seem to want anything to do with her. If you've been on my channel for any length of time, you probably know that Brandon Sanderson is one of my favorite authors, and this book did not disappoint me. I loved it. I loved the characters, I loved the setting, I really loved this book. I have no complaints about this. I recommend it to everyone. And if you are kind of new to sci-fi or new to Brandon Sanderson and don't know where to start, I would highly recommend this one. I think it's very palatable, both as a beginner sci-fi and as a beginner Brandon Sanderson book. And unsurprisingly, I gave this 5 stars. The next book I read, I picked up completely on a whim. I just decided to read it kind of out of nowhere, and that book is Leave the World Behind by Rumaan Alam. So this book is a thriller that follows Amanda and Clay, who are a couple, and their teenage children as they go on a vacation to a remote area of Long Island to escape their busy New York life. And they rent this beautiful, kind of luxurious place to stay. And on their first night there, they get a knock on the door, and the couple who owns the house is there basically begging to stay with them because there's been a massive blackout in New York City and they're scared to return home. And so these two couples plus the 2 teenagers are all kind of stuck in this remote place all together, and they don't really quite trust each other, and there's no way to confirm what's going on because they don't really have cell service at this place, and the cable and internet have cut out. This book was not my favorite. The beginning of it was quite intriguing for me, but it quickly kind of stalled out and I got very bored and nothing was really happening, and then the book just abruptly ended. To me, it felt like the author of this book had an idea for a premise and kind of started writing the book not knowing what was gonna happen, and then kind of just dragged it out, and then it was long enough to be a book, and so it was. Is that harsh? That's pretty harsh. And so I gave this 2 stars. The next book I read is a novella, and that is Comfort Me with Apples by Catherine M. Valente. I think this is also a relatively new release, and this is an adult horror book. I also talked about this extensively in my purple vlog, so I won't talk about it too much, but this book follows a woman named Sophia. And Sophia is just very happy and satisfied with her life, which is great. She lives in this very nice house in this very nice gated community, and she's very happily married. And her life kind of centers around making her husband happy. So she does all the cooking and all of the cleaning, and her husband is away a lot. So she ends up kind of missing him all the time. And her life is very kind of sterile and routine, and she starts to discover things that are out of the ordinary, that are quite dark and grim, and she starts to realize that her life isn't quite as perfect as she thought it was. This book is very rooted in religion, and there are a lot of biblical references in here. And I thought that this was a very kind of thought-provoking book. For me, I finished it and I kind of sat there and thought about it, and I actually needed to sleep on it before I could really even figure out how I felt about it. It definitely has a pretty crazy twist, one that I really couldn't have guessed, although in retrospect it's kind of obvious, but I had no idea at the time. So I was totally just along for the ride with this book, and it was a wild one. It's definitely a very strange book. It's definitely a very kind of macabre book, but I really liked it. I'm not sure that I would have liked it as much had I not had any exposure to religion or the Bible, because that's kind of essential to understanding it, in my opinion. But I loved it. I really, really liked it. It still like blows my mind to think about this book, and I ended up giving this one 4.5 stars. The next book I read in June was Dig by A.S. King. This is a YA magical realism book, but I want to emphasize that I think the magical kind of aspects of this book are fairly subtle. At least they are, I think, until you get sort of to the end. So I kind of want to say that this is a contemporary, but it does have that kind of slight magical element to it. And this book is pretty much impossible to summarize, but I will do my best. So we're following an older couple, Marla and Gottfried, as well as 7 teenagers, 5 of which are like somewhat likable and 2 of which are absolutely not likable. And then we're following kind of all of the somewhat awful adults in these teenagers' lives. Basically, this book, for the most part, feels very disjointed when you're reading it. And I don't want to say how all these characters are related, because I think that that's really part of reading this book. But all of these characters are kind of doing their own thing, and slowly their stories kind of collide and merge, and you get this like whole picture from all of these very disparate parts. This book is also kind of weird because a lot of the teenagers have strange nicknames, so you don't know what their names are. We have like the Shoveler, and we have Can I Help You? That's someone's name. And that's kind of a strange aspect of this book, but ultimately it isn't a comfortable read, but it is, I think, a very valuable read. It's uncomfortable for a reason, and this book contains a lot of commentary about white privilege specifically. This was a very intelligent, very brilliant book, in my opinion. It's definitely a very weird book. Very weird book. Similar to Comfort Me with Apples, but in a different way. I'd say they're both very, very weird books. Ultimately, I thought that the message of this was very thought-provoking and heartwarming, and I ended up giving this one 4 stars. I know that that's kind of a bad summary of this book, but I really think that if I give you more information, it won't hit as hard. And I think that that's a really important aspect of this book. So that's all you're gonna get from me. The next book I read in June was Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Su Lin Tan. This is a YA fantasy romance that's heavily based on Chinese mythology. We are following Xingyan, who is the daughter of the moon goddess. And she has been raised basically in isolation with her mother on the moon. And her mother was banished to the moon when she stole the elixir of immortality and became immortal. But at the time that she was banished, she was pregnant, and she basically has raised Xingyan on the moon in secret. Now Xingyan is a teenager, and she starts to experiment with her kind of magical abilities. But when she does this, the Celestial Empress, who banished Xingyan's mother, shows up on the moon and accuses her mother of harboring a fugitive. So, for her safety, Xingyin flees, and she flees to the Celestial Kingdom, where she befriends the Crown Prince, who is the son of the Celestial Empress. Sort of the enemy. And basically, Xingyin's just trying to survive, is kind of trying to figure out how to rescue her mother from exile, and she's also trying to keep her true identity a secret. I really enjoyed this book. I had a hard time at the beginning of it, kind of getting into it. I found the writing of this book to be very kind of elevated and formal, which kind of clashed with our young main character for me. It didn't really work for a little while, but once I got used to it, I started to really, really enjoy this book. I think the romance in here was really well done. It was really well developed. Probably the best romance I've read in a YA fantasy book. I also thought the structure of this book was it leaned more into kind of adult fantasy than YA fantasy for me, which I really enjoyed. And ultimately, I gave this 4 stars. I really enjoyed it, and I do plan to continue this series once the next book comes out. Next was the second nonfiction book that I read this month. Again, very happy that I picked up some nonfiction finally this year. And this is a book that I've been meaning to read for literal years. And that is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Other Lessons from the Crematory by Caitlin Doughty. So this book focuses on Caitlin Doughty's kind of early to mid 20s when she started working as a crematory operator at a crematorium in Oakland, California. And the book is a memoir that's kind of a combination of stories from the crematorium, reflections about the death industry and death in general, and a lot of kind of historical context for why the death industry is the way that it is today. But I would argue that the vast majority of it is kind of about Caitlin Doughty's experience and kind of reflections on this time in her life. And overall, I'd say it was a very kind of interesting and fascinating read. And I know that this might sound very grim, but Caitlin Doughty tells these stories with a lot of humor and lightheartedness. And while there are times in the book that are very heavy, I think that Caitlin Doughty's kind of argument in this book is that our kind of fear of death and the kind of taboo nature of talking about death and seeing death has kind of negatively impacted the way that our society handles death and processes death, I guess, as a whole. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, so I really, really enjoyed reading about San Francisco. It made me very, very nostalgic. But I also just thought this book was extremely interesting and extremely insightful. And while I wouldn't recommend it for somebody who's actively grieving, I think it's a book that can help people process death and kind of see death from a different perspective. And because of that, I think that this is a book that will kind of stick with me for a very, very long time. I ended up not rating this one because it's a memoir, and I don't feel tremendously comfortable rating memoirs just because, I don't know, I feel like there's someone's like personal experiences and it's weird to rate that. And it's very vulnerable to write a memoir, and I like to just read them and kind of accept them for what they are. But I really, really, really enjoyed this book and highly recommend it. The next book I read was another novella, and that was All Systems Red by Martha Wells. This is the first book in the Murderbot series. I feel like this series is better known as the Murderbot series. And all of the books in this series are novellas, which is kind of cool. So this book takes place in a kind of futuristic society that's largely governed by corporations. Lovely, I know. So in this world, the company is in charge of approving and supplying missions. And all missions are required to take along a kind of sophisticated AI robot that is basically like a security bot and is in charge of protecting the people on the mission. Our main character is one such bot, but our bot has hacked its own governor module and doesn't actually have to obey the people on the mission, which the rest of them do. And our particular bot is very introverted and really doesn't want to interact with anybody. I kind of described this book to Sean as like a book about a robot with social anxiety because that's really what it is. But basically, this story takes off when things start to go wrong on this mission, and it's up to our robot, who calls itself Murderbot, and the scientists on its mission to figure out what's going on. I was kind of torn about this book because I loved the characters. I loved Murderbot wholeheartedly, but I found myself kind of drifting when I was reading this, mostly because it's very heavy on the like technical and scientific jargon, and that isn't fleshed out enough, at least wasn't fleshed out enough for me to feel like I had a grasp on like the technicalities of what was going on in this book, but I loved the characters. So I ended up giving this one 3.5 stars. I do recommend it. I am going to continue this series, but it was heavy on the jargon. I'm hoping that the next books aren't, but we'll see. And the final book that I read in June that I squeezed in at the last minute was Heartstopper Volume 1 by Alice Oseman. Listen, I know I'm the last person on planet Earth to read this book, and I kind of read it on a whim, to be honest. At the end of the month, I kind of was like, all right, it was Pride Month. I read no Pride books. I don't feel good about this, and I really wanted to read one. And everyone has been talking about this series because it was recently adapted on Netflix as a TV show. And this first book is available for free on Webtoon, which is how I read it, so nobody's got any excuse, including myself. So this book follows two high schoolers, Charlie and Nick. It mostly follows Charlie at the beginning, who is openly gay and is generally kind of an overthinker, slightly anxious, very relatable and very, very endearing character. And he becomes friends with a boy at school who's a year older than him named Nick. And Nick is this kind of jock rugby player, but has a heart of gold. I was thinking about how to describe Nick, and my best description for him is like golden retriever energy. Also an absolutely endearing character. So this book follows Nick and Charlie as they kind of become friends and develop this really, really cute friendship and begin to develop feelings for one another. My heart melted when I read this book. I read it in like, I want to say like an hour. This is a graphic novel. I should have prefaced with that. This is a graphic novel, hence why I was able to read it in about an hour. I kind of flew through it, and when it was over, I was like, I need more of this. I really need more of this. So I'm probably going to end up purchasing the first volume and the rest of the books pretty soon. Yeah, this was beautiful. I really, really want to watch the Netflix series now. I need to research how much reading I need to do before I delve into that, but 5 stars. This was great. Highly, highly recommended. Loved it. So cute, so perfect. Beautiful. So that is it for the books that I read in June. I'm currently reading People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry, as well as A Court of Wings and Ruin by Sarah J. Maas. I know, I started ACOWAR, finally, and I'm really enjoying it. So those are the 2 books that you can expect to see in my July wrap up. If you're new to my channel, please consider liking this video and subscribing. And if you are still here, thank you so much for being here. I always really appreciate it, and I will see you next time.